Welcome back to the MSU Deer Labs online seminar series. It is brought to you by the Mississippi State University Extension Service as well as the MSU Forest and Wildlife Research Center. I will be your presenter today. My name is Bronson Strickland, and I want to acknowledge my colleague and the co-director of the MSU Deer Lab, Steve Damaris. As the name implies, this presentation is all about cool season food plots. Want to review everything more or less that we've learned over the past 10 or 15 years. Want to go over the most common forages, their nutrient profiles, which plants work well, which ones work well in mixes, and which ones deer are attracted to. When we're finished with the presentation, my goal is that you are going to feel completely equipped to know what to plant on your property and why. By no means is this every possible thing you could write about or talk about with cool season food plots, but I think it's a really good collection, certainly for people starting out to get you going. The brassicas. Several different forages within this category. Probably the four most common, rape and kale, that are just going to yield forage biomass above ground, and then turnips and radishes, which of course have above ground biomass for forage, as well as the root that can be consumed by deer. So all of those fall within the brassica category. Probably one of the most discussed and debated groups of forages for deer because people have a lot of different experiences with them. And I think there's a lot of explanations for this. It could be the novelty. Some people try, for example, they may try rape or turnips one time, didn't really see the deer select for them very heavily, and they thought, well, the deer don't like them, and so I'm done with them. But keep in mind, there's a novelty aspect to this as well. Sometimes it takes a deer a year or two or longer to try a new forage. And the next year, you'll notice you'll get more utilization. And then, after 4 or 5 years, it's consumed as much as all the other forages that you plant. So there's the novelty aspect of it the first time you plant it. There can also be, I think what most people think of is the temperature aspect of it. When we think back to turnips and collards and things like that, also brassica, that we were always told don't pick them until after the first frost. That then they're not going to be as bitter, they're going to taste sweeter, and I'll talk a little bit about that more on the next slide. And so there may be some truth to that as well. There may be some chemical changes going on that make them more palatable. It could also be that the brassicas are very cold tolerant. It might be that in a certain part of the year, it just so happens when it gets really cold, when you see deer select them, that some of your other forages may have slowed down from growing or stopped growing if they're not very cold tolerant. And so that's the only actively growing forage in your plot, and therefore deer selecting them. So there's a lot of different explanations from this. My personal experience is that I've had great success with them, and I have it also as part of my toolbox is including a brassica. A couple things in terms of kind of the profile is that, like most every forage, they're going to perform better on your well-drained soils and not as good on heavy clay soils. And that is unfortunately where I'm at, is heavier clay soils, and they can also be wet because of that. So I think I don't get as much forage production out of them as other people do. This forage can produce a lot of biomass in a good soil, and especially in a monoculture. You'll literally get 2, 3, 4 tons of forage from a plant like this. However, you need to think about when it is in a mix. As you can see, the shape of the leaf is very broad. It can shade out some of the other forages, specifically clover. So at that time of year, in the fall and later in the fall and winter when the brassica is really growing. That broad leaf is going to shade out some of the forages underneath it, and most often that is going to be clover. So again, very cold tolerant, and that might explain why we see so much selection, at least I do, see so much selection for brassicas when it gets really cold. And you might even think about, can you use that as a strategy? I think most often we plant mixes, but that might be a time to where you can plant an entire plot in a brassica and watch how it's utilized. And probably if the deer are going to utilize it is when it gets really cold. And that might be, you know, a place that you can direct your hunting pressure on that plot. When it gets cold, go to the brassica plot. So just something to consider there. The planting rate is relatively low. It's very similar to a clover, white clover. The drill rate, and this all depends on your variety, 3 to 4 pounds per acre. Broadcast is 4 to 8 pounds per acre, again, depending on the variety. Typically, when we include these in a mix, we will never recommend, or I'll never recommend, over 2 pounds per acre. It's usually 1 or 2 pounds per acre based on the reasons I discussed earlier about not wanting to outcompete or shade out the clovers that I have in the mix. I thought a quick review of this graphic would be beneficial relative to the topic of brassicas and cool weather and maybe changes in palatability. This is an article that was published in Quality Whitetails, the spring 2021 issue. This research was conducted by Mark Turner, Bonner Powell, and Dr. Craig Harper from the University of Tennessee. And I think it provides some really interesting data on plant quality attributes of some of these brassicas. And let's take kale, the kale leaves, for example. So we're going to stay within kale, and we're going to look at some of these diagnostics on the left. Now, red is pre-frost, blue is post-frost. Notice with crude protein, we really don't see any change at all. ADF, that's an index of fiber, the lower the better. Notice that pre-frost, there's actually more fiber in the leaves and less after the frost, so yeah, that's good. Simple sugars, also, we see a little bit of an increase here after the frost. Is that enough to drive selection demonstrably more after frost? I don't know. We'd have to ask the deer, but we do see a subtle change. Same thing with starch. We see a little bit more after the frost, but this is what's interesting to me. We also see an increase in sulfur. Now, sulfur is a mineral that deer typically select against, to the point in some environments deer have to be guarded against too much intake of sulfur. You can actually have a toxicity because of it. So that likely depends upon the background level of sulfur that is in the naturally occurring vegetation. And so that was some research we did previously with Jacob Dykes, was the student, and we also published that article in Quality Whitetails. But that's one thing that we noticed, is that deer are, of course, selecting for forages that are higher in crude protein, lower in fiber, but also lower in their sulfur content. But it really depends. That may be part of the explanation we see from place to place of how on this particular property they really eat brassicas readily, and on this one not so much. It could be something like sulfur. Naturally occurring forages that deer are eating are relatively high in sulfur, and so they're just selecting against a plant that has a lot of that mineral. Just another potential explanation. So we kind of see with kale that it kind of follows the logic of, yeah, this cold weather may be really changing these plant quality attributes, but it's a little bit interesting in how starch goes up, sugars go up, fiber goes down, but sulfur goes up as well. Notice though, now with turnip leaves, we really don't see a consistent pattern here like we did with kale leaves. Not much of a change in fiber, little bit of a change, increase in simple sugars, not really with starch, and a little bit of a change, not as drastic, but certainly again more of the sulfur post-frost. So I included this graphic. This is something you can maybe pause this presentation, look at it a while, and see what you think. But I thought this was a very clever research idea, and glad those guys published it and made it available to all of us. Another forage to consider is Austrian winter pea. I have planted this several times, and I think it is a very good option for some people. And what do I mean by that? I mean that every time I've planted it, the deer have consumed it, but I was disappointed in the amount of biomass that I got from the forage. And that is likely due to, as I mentioned with the Brassicas previously, probably a limitation of the soils I'm in. So I was just never really overwhelmed with how much biomass production I could get from Austrian winter pea in the soils that they're planted in. This is another legume. It's a low-growing, viney legume. No worries at all about cold weather, very winter hardy. It's not, even though it's a viney legume, you're not going to have just this exponential growth like you think of something like a cowpea or soybean or something like that. It's going to be slower, but no doubt about it, deer like it, deer consume it, very high quality plant. Because deer like it so much and because it can be a little slower growing, it can be overbrowsed. And so many people that I trust that have great success with Austrian winter pea, they recommend putting it in a mix. And as always, this is a legume. I seriously doubt you're going to find it pre-inoculated. You might, but I don't think so. So don't forget to inoculate with strain C. Seeding depths are going to be very much like cereal grains. That is also an issue I've had in my soils a couple times, is I don't think I got it deep enough. And I think I had a lot of mortality from critters because it took a while for germination to occur, and after the rain, the seeds were exposed, or part of the seed was exposed, and I noticed I would have a lot of crows and turkey in my plot. So I would probably seed it just like a cereal grain and try to get it, half an inch deep or something as close as you can to that. Planting rate is about 30 pounds per acre in a monoculture if you were to drill it, and about 50 pounds per acre if you broadcast. But do not let me discourage you from exploring this forage. This may perform beautifully on your property. I think it's definitely worth trying. You may not want to go all out and plant just acres and acres of it when you first try it, but maybe add it into a mix into one of your, quarter acre plots or half acre plots. See how well it grows. Put an exclusion cage around it so you can look at the difference between what's growing in the cage and what's growing out to get an idea of how well this forage performs on your property. So you may be asking yourself, what about ryegrass? I covered the cereal grains, clovers, brassicas, some other forages, and I never devoted any time to ryegrass. Well, I'm going to do that now. I'm going to tell you exactly how I feel about ryegrass and hopefully can defend my thoughts and my perspective. And I'll call this, What About Ryegrass? The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So here's the good. Ryegrass grows just about anywhere. If there was a situation where you were having a really hard time to get any kind of cereal grain to grow, you can probably get ryegrass to grow there. You can see here in both of these photos, there is clearly the grass will grow very well. Notice in November, we typically plant the beginning of October, so by November we see a very rich plot of very, very thick, dense, very good performance. We can see even by December the amount of biomass that has been produced, we can see comparing inside versus outside the cage that, yeah, deer are eating it. There's no doubt about it, especially if you have taken a soil test and applied lime and fertilizer to specifications. You are going to get a lot of growth and yield, and most likely, depending on what other forages are available, that's always a caveat there. If deer have a choice, they're going to select other forages too, and in some places they may not select ryegrass as much. On this property, we did have other forages available simultaneously, and the deer also selected ryegrass. So I would say that's the good. In a lot of places, it's just about a fail-safe that you are going to get a nice green plot out of ryegrass. So that part is good, and most likely deer are going to eat it. But now let's move on to the bad and the ugly. So now the bad and the ugly. One of the characteristics of ryegrass that makes it very beneficial, depending on your perspective and what you want, and I'm thinking here for grazing for livestock, for example, is that ryegrass is a prolific reseeder. It reseeds itself very well. It is an annual plant, so it's not a perennial. It's an annual plant, but it reseeds itself very well. The photo on the left, this plot where all you see right now is ryegrass, we did not plant it. That was when we assumed management of this particular property. The people before us used to plant ryegrass. So this is just coming up from residual seed. And notice how at this time of year had completely taken over the plot. As a consequence to that, you will see, like on the right-hand side, that during the spring and late spring of the year, and again, remember your strategy here, we're trying to provide as much quality forage for the longest period of time with our cool season planting. So by this time, by May, whether it be ryegrass or the cereal grains, wheat, oats, rye, they are pretty much finished. Well, they are finished in terms of providing any quality forage to deer. They are either dead or dying. They are very low quality. Deer are not going to eat it. But what we have to be concerned about now is, can we provide an environment that is going to allow those other forages, primarily I'm thinking of clover here, are we going to be able to let it grow and flourish so that we can now extend the window of our planting all the way until May, June, July, depending on what clover you want. So that is the primary reason why I don't like planting ryegrass. And other people in natural resource management go a step further, and they're right, is that ryegrass can just become invasive. So I don't really see the benefit of planting it, given the issues we have with it in the spring of the year and potentially becoming invasive. In terms of biomass production, very comparable with the other cereal grains. In terms of quality, very comparable with the other cereal grains. And you do not have the downside like you're seeing on this slide here. So another example on this same property, planted in the same forage, two different plots, but on the same property, both planted in white clover. And then on the left, notice that we used clethodim and we sprayed the ryegrass. So it killed all of the grasses in April. And look at the white clover that we have in June. And on the very same day, the plot that again was planted in white clover, and we did not spray it, notice the difference. So to me, I think it is crystal clear based on your objectives. And let me revisit that. My objective is to provide as much quality forage for deer for the longest period of time. And if I take ryegrass out of that food plot, that is going to enable me to release and promote these other forages like clover.